Boy, we got a lot of big games this week. Uh, we got so many big games this week. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to cover them all over the course of a week. So, figured I'd get started now. I think there are three games I think involving top 15 teams where both teams are in the top 15 and undefeated. Right? Of course, Alabama, Tennessee, TCU, Oklahoma State, and Penn State and Michigan, which I want to talk about today. Both these teams in the top 10 of almost every single ranking or poll that you look at. Michigan, the higher ranked team. Michigan's anywhere from 4, 5, 6. Penn State's anywhere, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. Great matchup, Big Ten East matchup. So you got division implications, right? Which of course leads to Big Ten Conference title implications and potentially playoffs down the road. The Big Ten East, just like last year, is probably the best division in football right now. Three teams from the Big Ten East undefeated and in the top 10, Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. We get to see two of them square off this Saturday in Ann Arbor. Penn State travels to take on Michigan. And boy, Penn State's got a tough stretch of games coming up, starting with this one against Michigan. They play Minnesota. Now, there's a bye week in here. It's the bye week before Ohio State. Anyway, Penn State's next three games are Michigan this coming week. Then they have Minnesota and then Ohio State. And you laugh at Minnesota if you want to, but they're probably the best team in the Big Ten West. I know they lost 2 weeks ago. Their running back was out. And Minnesota's not a great team. They're not a top 10 team, but they were undefeated and they were just obliterating people up until that point. Mohamed Ibrahim had to sit that game out and Minnesota took a bad loss. They were off last week. He's supposed to be back this week. So I expect Minnesota to get back to their winning ways this week. But this is a tough game stretch coming up for Michigan, starting this week or Penn State, I'm sorry. Starting this week on the road at Michigan. And the questions about James Franklin just won't go away. Now, I'll go to my grave thinking James Franklin's a pretty good head coach because as a Georgia fan, I saw what he did at Vanderbilt in the SEC. And in my lifetime, I've never seen anybody do that. He had Vanderbilt winning 8, 9 games a year. That's just absolutely unbelievable. Outside of that one big year he had at Penn State, though, it has been a little bit of a letdown. And quarterback Sean Clifford is back. He got hurt last year, and the season kind of tanked after that. But is he ever going to win a big game? Sean Clifford is not an elite level quarterback. He's kind of a security blanket. Like, you know what you're going to get with Sean Clifford, right? He's very rarely going to blow a game, I guess, but he's just not the type of QB that's going to take a game over. And his record in big games has not been good. And this is not going to be easy for him to travel on the road here at Michigan. Now, he's got a ton of experience. He's a 6-year guy. So in terms of environments and crowd noise and defensive looks and things like that, he's pretty much seen it all. And, of course, he led Penn State down to Auburn a few weeks ago and absolutely destroyed them on the road at Auburn. And, while I will admit Auburn's not a great team, I can tell you as somebody who's a fan of a team that plays Auburn every single year, and we play at Auburn every other year, it is not easy to win there, never mind blow them out. Hell, Auburn plays Alabama every single year. So Auburn and Alabama play every other year in Auburn. Alabama doesn't beat Auburn like that when they play there. Very rare. That was the worst home loss for Auburn in over a decade. So that was an impressive win. Not that it was necessarily because it was Auburn, but because of how bad they beat them. And Sean Clifford this year has been kind of the quarterback I think he's been the best case. He's been the best you can hope he can be, I think, right? You know who he is by now. He's completing 60% of his passes. Like I said, he's not going to take over games, but I think he's done as well as anyone really could expect. There was one bad game he had, particularly in the first half, where at one point he was like 10 of 20 or something. And there's a really highly rated freshman up there, Alwar or Anwar, whatever his name is, at Penn State. And of course, anytime a quarterback struggles, believe me, I know this as a Georgia fan, you want to see the backup quarterback. But it's just Sean Clifford's team. And it would be huge for him and Penn State if they were to go into Michigan and get this win. The story for Penn State really this year has been the ground game. Last year, they didn't have a single running back rush for over 100 yards in a game for like the first time in forever. And Penn State's had some good running backs here recently. Of course, everybody knows or is going to think of Saquon Barkley. But even besides him, they've had some good running backs. But boy, they got two really good ones this year. Both freshmen, aren't they? I know Nick Singleton as a freshman, and he's been absolutely unbelievable. The number 2 running back, I think, is a freshman too, and he's been almost just as good. So a great 1-2 punch on the ground game for Penn State. And their defense has played pretty good. They're giving up only about 14 or 15 points per game. Pretty good Penn State team. I feel like they're not really getting the attention that they deserve. I don't mean from Michigan. I know Michigan's taking this game seriously, but I mean from a national perspective, I don't hear very many people talking about Penn State. I mean, they're highly ranked. They're in the top 10. It's not that they're disrespected or anything like that, but I rarely, I do a bunch of live shows and call-in shows. I rarely get anybody that wants to talk about Penn State. When I watch the big talking heads on TV or YouTube, I don't hear all that much about Penn State. I think they're a legitimately good team. Are they good enough to go on the road and beat Michigan? And we'll talk about Michigan in a second. Well, when you look at what Penn State does well, that is something that travels. I mean, a ground game and a good defense travels well generally. This is going to be a great matchup. 2 really good defenses. Michigan, I think, has had the better overall offense. I'm not a stats guy or an X's and O's guy or anything, so I'm not going to quote you a bunch of yards per game or yards per rush or yards per attempt stats. But just from watching both of these teams play multiple games this year, it's pretty clear to me that Michigan does have a little bit better of an offense than Penn State. We'll see how that matches up when they get down. Let's talk about Michigan for a little bit. Of course, they have decided to go with J.J. McCarthy at quarterback this year, which made a lot of their fans happy. And Jim Harbaugh, I think, caught a break. I hate using that word. McNamara got injured. And I hate it when anybody gets injured on any team for any reason, for any amount of time. But again, going into this season, Harbaugh had a hard time making up his mind about the quarterback situation. McNamara was the starter all last year, but McCarthy would play a little in every game. The fans were kind of sick of it. They wanted to see more of McCarthy. And then heading into this season, Harbaugh came up with this weird plan where one of them was going to play the first game, the other one was going to play the second game, and then he was going to make a decision for week 3. Well, by the time week 3 came around, McNamara was injured, so Harbaugh's hand was kind of forced, and he went with McCarthy. Now, I think he made the right decision. I think McCarthy has a much higher upside than McNamara, and I really like what McCarthy can do with his legs, too. Michigan lost those 2 edge rushers last year to the draft, and a lot of people, myself included, had some questions about how they would be able to replace that in terms of production for this year. When you watch Michigan play, it doesn't even look like they're missing them. Michigan's defense looks legit. I've been extremely impressed with Michigan in almost every single game they've played. Even the Maryland game, which Michigan takes a lot of heat for the Maryland game, and I really don't get it. I think Maryland is a decent team. Again, not a top 10 team, probably not even a top 15 team, but, shoot, they're talented. That's still Maryland's only loss, a 34-27 win by Michigan in that game. But Michigan has looked really, really good. It's not a surprise to me. I'll put the line up now so you can see it, but Michigan is currently a 7-point favorite in this game against Penn State. And it's hard for me to imagine Michigan losing this one at home, I'll be honest with you. I do like Penn State in the 7 points here. I think this is going to be a close game. I think it's going to be a little more low scoring maybe than what people are used to. Michigan's been scoring a ton of points. Broke a school record. They scored 150 points in their first 3 games, averaged over 50 points a game the first 3 games. First time they'd ever done that in school history. Now, to be fair, Michigan had one of the worst non-conference schedules in all the Power 5. They just played 3 horrific Group of 5 teams to start the season out. Now, that doesn't mean they're not any good. I mean, if you play bad teams, what are you supposed to do? Blow them out, and that's what Michigan did. I just mean maybe those numbers are a little misleading just based on the low quality of opponents they played for the first 3 weeks. A little sketchy at times this past week against Indiana, but, man, scary situation on the sideline there for Michigan. Assistant coach Mike Hart, was it? Basically collapsed on the sideline. I guess he had a seizure. They had to stop the game for a while. Bring the paramedics out, the stretcher, cart him off the field, the whole deal. That had to have an impact and an effect on the team. So I'm going to give Michigan a little bit of a break on that. And they did pull away in the end in the fourth quarter and ended up winning, I think, 31-10 over a bad Indiana team. But, tied up 10 apiece at halftime. And the same thing for Penn State. They played a game a couple of weeks ago, and no one watched the game. Then they just looked at the box score. I think it was like 17-7 over Northwestern, was it? And people were like, "Oh my God, how do you barely beat Northwestern?" They played in a hurricane, the remnants of Hurricane Ian. The field was an absolute mess. It was wet. So again, 2 games where you point to with Michigan and Indiana, and then Penn State, and I think it was Northwestern, and people kind of scratching their head about the final score. There are circumstances in both of those games I think you can look at where you can sort of excuse maybe those below standard performances by those 2 teams. But this is going to be a hell of a game, Penn State versus Michigan. It feels like James Franklin and Sean Clifford, the head coach and quarterback for Penn State, really need this win. They need a big win. There's a lot of James Franklin doubters out there, and he has underperformed in big games over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And even if you don't expect Penn State to beat Ohio State every single year, Ohio State's one of the top 3 programs in the country. No one's going to beat them year after year after year after year after year. What you have to do is be able to beat them when, every once in a while when you're supposed to, and Penn State just hasn't been able to do that. Home, away hasn't seemed to matter. Same thing with Michigan and with Penn State. It just seems like every time there's a big game for Penn State that people start pointing to, Penn State and Sean Clifford have found ways to lose them. They need to get over that hump if they're going to have a chance in this one. I just don't think they can do it on the road in Ann Arbor. I'm a buyer in Michigan. I've got them in my top 4 right now. In fact, I think I had them at 3 in my top 25 I put out earlier today. But I do think Penn State's a legitimate team, possibly even a legitimate top 10 team. Let's be real. You can lose to Michigan or Ohio State and still be a top 10 team, right? You can lose to a top 4, 5, 6 team and still be a top 10 team. We'll see. We'll see. I think it's going to be a good game, low scoring. If you're Penn State, that's what you got to do. You got to slow this thing down, keep Michigan's offense off the field, keep your defense rested. Penn State needs to be able to grind out first downs with those running backs. We'll see if they can do it. 2 really good defenses. I talked a lot about Penn State's running game and then the quarterback situation at Michigan, but let's not forget the running back situation at quarterback situation, but let's not forget about the running backs. Blake Corum he's so much fun to watch. Is he one of the best 2 or 3 running backs in college football? He might be. We can argue about that. But he's definitely one of the most exciting and fun running backs to watch in all of college football. I remember way back in the spring, I'm just a college football lunatic, so, these spring games come on TV. I watched the Michigan spring game to see how they planned on replacing the running back they lost from last year. And it just seemed like every time something good happened in that spring game, it was because Blake Corum had the ball. And so I kind of followed his progress through the offseason. And, of course, he's been the go-to guy for Michigan when it comes to their ground game, and he hasn't disappointed. The guy's an absolute beast. 2 really, really good running backs here in this game with Nick Singleton at Penn State and Blake Corum at Michigan. Should be a good game. At Michigan is what does it for me. I do think Michigan gets the win here. I'm going to take Penn State in the 7 points. Have a good morning.